By 1914 in Europe, the political situation was utterly unstable. Germany and Britain came out of the last century as the two major powerhouses, but France, Austria, Italy, and Russia all held significant influence of their own. The dying men of Europe, the Ottomans, had experienced two wars against the small Balkan nations to the north in the first decade of the 20th century, weakening them further. Due to the Berlin Conference and imperial ambitions, most European powers held land in Africa and Asia. There were four main causes behind World War I. The first one was militarism, generally due to a lack of big wars in the latter half of the 19th century. The major European powers had begun to build up their militaries in preparation for a war. A good example of this is the naval arms race between Britain and Germany, which also had the result of increasing tensions between the two great powers. Another factor in the cause of World War I is alliances. The major powers of Europe had organized themselves into two major blocs. The Triple Entente consisted of France, the UK, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria, and Italy. During the war, these alliances would change though. The Ottomans joined Austria and Germany, and the US joined the Triple Entente. Also, Italy would betray Germany and Austria and join the Triple Entente as well. Imperialism also played a role in causing World War I. The competition for foreign land created more tension between the great powers. Nationalism created public support for the wars due to a desire in the people to find glory for their nation and national identity. For example, French nationalism caused the populace to loathe Germany for taking Alsace-Lorraine from them in the Franco-Prussian War. Militarism also caused countries to create new and deadly technology to outdo their opponents on the battlefield. Such new creations were machine guns, barbed wires, tanks, gas, submarines, and airplanes. These would prove to make warfare significantly deadlier. Protests in Russia caused even more tension and instability in Europe. And the Irish Easter Rebellion was yet another example of rampant nationalism and militarism. Nationalism wasn't just limited to Europe. The Ottomans committed genocide against the Armenians, and the Japanese had a desire to take Germany's Pacific Islands, which caused them to join the war on the side of the Allies. What kicked off the war, though, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to Austria-Hungary, which set off the powder keg of Europe. Germany attempted to use their Schlieffen Plan to attack France, looping through Belgium. They were stopped and held at a stalemate by the British and French, leading the armies to entrench their positions and create a whole new form of devastating warfare. On the eastern front, the Germans and Austrians fought the Russians. The Russians eventually succumbed to civil war and the overthrow of their Tsar, leading them to sign separate peace in 1917. Germany was eventually worn down by the British blockade and entrance of America into the war. They surrendered and signed the Treaty of Versailles, putting blame on Germany for the war, forcing them to pay mass reparations, heavily limiting their military, and creating the Weimar Republic. The Mandate system was established, and Germany's colonies were split between the Allies. Out of the dust of Russia and Austria-Hungary appeared new successor states: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. The League of Nations was also formed out of President Wilson's ideals, but it proved to be weak due to lack of enforcement. Russia's troubles in World War I created a civil war. Lenin's Bolsheviks seized control of the government and created the Soviet Union. Lenin, and later Stalin's, policies would turn the Soviet Union into an economic and political powerhouse, finally ending Russia's long history of backwardness. Section 2. Interwar and World War II. With the end of the Great War, dubbed the War to End All Wars, Europe's powers steadily shifted back into the Allied powers' hands. Out of the war came the Weimar Republic, after the November Revolution in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles decimated Germany's economy and power in Europe. The War Guilt Clause led to Germany's paying of war reparations, which added to Germany's economic instability. Inflation rates rose as no reforms or policies were able to be made to combat this. Germany also experienced the effects of the Great Depression, which is stacked onto an already horrible economy. Germany's army was also downscaled by the Treaty of Versailles. Their air force was prohibited. The Great Depression also affected other European countries that were in debt to the US, such as the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, however, made use of Keynesian economics to combat this. Keynesian economics were situated to be able to help the economy during times of recession through use of government policy. Fascism also rose up along some European countries. The fascist ideology is based on dictatorial power, a strong economy, and a society with nationalistic roots. Italian fascism resonated with Mussolini, who brought up the idea. Germany also applied fascism with Hitler. Hitler takes power through the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, through the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial powers. He built support with his use of propaganda, racism, and anti-Semitism. This allowed him to rule dictatorially without any political consequence. He remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He also annexed Austria, which was widely welcomed in the country. The Munich Conference had also allowed Germany to annex parts of Czechoslovakia. This was due to Neville Chamberlain's idea of appeasement, which was also followed by the French government. Letting Hitler get what he wanted would discourage war in Europe, which the Allies did not want. The Soviet Union, now newly formed and headed by Stalin, experienced rapid change to its economy and society. Stalin implemented the 5-year plan in order to jumpstart Russia's industrialization and Russia's economy, at the cost of the death of millions. At the same time, he purged filth communists and sent them to the gulags, which were work camps. The Axis powers were formed before the start of the war. This axis of Italy, Germany, and Japan combined the powers of the 3 fascist nations of the world. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland using blitzkrieg tactics. This called for the speed and power of tanks to defeat the enemy swiftly. Germany then went around the indestructible Maginot Line on the French-German border through Belgium. The same blitzkrieg tactics were used to take down France when they reached Paris. Technology such as the radio assisted the Germans' military might and helped the spread of propaganda, which was essential for popular support for the government. The war would continue with Hitler's domination of Europe. With Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union was invaded, and Hitler's army reached all the way to Moscow, but this failed to cause the Union to fall. The USA entered the war due to the bombing of Japan.
Having guaranteed Polish boundaries, Britain and France were now forced into war. They would soon pay heavily for their past mistakes, their fears, and their selfishness.
Ended with the Soviet capture of Berlin and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by President Harry Truman. The Nuremberg trials ensued, which convicted the Nazi war criminals and revealed the horrors of the concentration camps undertaken by the Nazi government. Section 3. The Cold War. In the aftermath of World War II, the United Nations was formed as a successor state to the League of Nations. This time, it would prove effective, with the support of all the great powers, and had the ability to actually enforce its decisions. It became the world's new peacekeeping force. The US and the Soviet Union came out of World War II as both rivals and the 2 greatest powers in the world. The US dominated influence in Western Europe, while the Soviets controlled the East. The Soviets established satellite states all over Eastern Europe, forming what is called the Iron Curtain. Germany was split between the Allies and the Soviets after the war. This occupation, which was supposed to be temporary, ended up creating a full split. Germany, as well as Berlin, was split into East and West counterparts. The US provided money to a war-torn Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, eventually creating a post-war economic miracle. They also created a geopolitical alliance in the form of NATO. The Soviets would create their own counterpart with the Warsaw Pact. New monetary and trade systems were developed that increased globalization and global connectedness. Examples are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, providing money to poorer nations, and the World Trade Organization, making worldwide trade more efficient. The Cold War was arguably even more global than World War II. It consisted of covert actions such as political assassinations and secret coups, and limited hot wars throughout the world. These hot wars consisted of limited conflict between the Soviets and the US, almost always in support of 2 opposing countries rather than directly at war. These wars were over democratic versus communist influence. In both the Korean and Vietnam Wars, communist and democratic forces clashed to instate their preferred form of government on these 2 Asian nations. Looming over all of this was the threat of nuclear annihilation brought on by an arms race between the Soviets and the Americans. The arms race branched off into a space race, which brought significant aeronautical technological developments. The Soviet economic model of central planning, social welfare, and specialized production also brought on restrictions of individual rights and freedoms. Post-1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev instituted a policy of de-Stalinization which proved troublesome for the Soviet economy. This, combined with the desire for more individual rights, prompted revolts in Eastern Europe such as the Prague Spring and Hungarian Revolt that were swiftly crushed by Russian forces. Decolonization came after World War II. Many imperial powers were reluctant to relinquish control of their valuable colonial lands. The U.S. pressured the last European colonial powers, mainly Britain and France, to relinquish control. This decolonization was not done gracefully, though. Many countries, India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, and really most of Africa, were left with unstable economic and political systems. In the late 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev instituted two new policies following a long period of economic stagnation. First, perestroika, transitioned the Soviet Union closer to a free market and created new governmental reforms to make the country more democratic. Glasnost created more openness in the Soviet Union in terms of individual freedoms, such as freedom of speech and press. Gorbachev failed to stave off the collapse of the Soviet Union, which occurred in 1991. It was the end of Soviet hegemonic control of Eastern Europe, and new democratic nations were birthed out of its ashes. Section 4. Modern History. At the end of the Cold War and dissolution of the Soviet Union, the once communist countries were now dependent on the Western powers. The formation of the EU sought to improve economy, society, and technology by sharing. This created single currency and no hard borders as well. New foundations formed to improve European cooperation. These included the European Economic Community, as well as the European Union itself. National sovereignty within a country's membership within the EU was also questioned, such as Britain's Brexit and free border movement. The digital revolution also changed how most European countries function. New online devices, such as computers, internet, and cell phones, changed how society communicated, allowing instant transmission of news and information. In the present, nationalistic elements also make a slight return. The nationalist parties in multiple European countries have turned the tide to the once liberal and democratic countries. Examples are the Five-Star Movement and election of Mussolini's granddaughter in Italy, as well as the protests in France and Poland. Green parties also rose up, based on environmentalism, nonviolence, and social justice. Art and science in the modern period concern new movements in the visual arts, architecture, and music, radically shifting existing aesthetic standards, exploring subconscious and subjective states, and satirizing Western society and its values. For example, Cubism was drawn with shapes and cubes, Futurism, which presented technology and industrialization, Dadaism, which was against standards of society/rebellion, Surrealism, which completely ditched reality, Abstract Expressionism, which represented Abstract Expressionism, which represented spontaneous emotional expression, and pop art, which represented pop culture, like advertisements and media. Lastly, the challenge to the certainties of the Newtonian universe in physics opened the door to uncertainty in other fields by undermining faith in objective knowledge, while also providing the knowledge necessary for the development of nuclear weapons and power. Examples of this are Albert Einstein, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Enrico Fermi, and Niels Bohr.